So, thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Just saw my cutout.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to a special edition of Outside of the Books. And if you were with us when we did the Outside of the Books Liberal Arts Luncheon with Dr. Black and Denise Zubizarreta in August of 2020, we considered that kind of an audition. I needed to get an upgrade to my research partner, and so after trying out a couple of guest presenters, we had Sean Piquet in, we had Jaime Carrero in. I decided to go back to where it all began, and Denise, you're in. You're it. The new Outside of the Books. Zubizarreta and Keefe. What do you think? It just rolls off the tongue.
It does, doesn't it? It's going to take up the whole circular logo. The whole. It's going to be great.
I will drop this in the chat later in the presentation. But again, Denise did join us in August of 2020 and helped us with a presentation on Outside of the Books with Puerto Rico. And we called it Living in Two Worlds. And I'll magnanimously allow Denise to introduce herself. But my name is Tom Keefe. I am a cis male, and I am an academic. I do not identify as Cuban. I am part of this presentation today to support the great work that VAMP's been doing. And that's who I am. VAMP, how about you?
So I'm VAMP Denise Zubizarreta. I am a mixed media interdisciplinary artist. And right now, a lot of my focus is on sociological research about the Caribbean with an influence of colonization. So it's been kind of the path that I'm going forward towards my PhD, and that's what I'm pretty much working on right now. I am a Cuban and Puerto Rican American. So I was born in Beaufort, South Carolina on a military base, Parris Island, if you're familiar with the United States Marine Corps. And I'm second generation on my father's side, which is Cuban, and first on my mother's Puerto Rican side. So it hits close to home that we're having these massive conversations about both countries right now in the media, politically, but also for a lot of other different reasons as well. So I'm excited.
So some of the people joining us may or may not be aware of what you're just referring to, what's in the news, but there have been protests in Cuba, and I believe it's more accurate to pronounce it Cuba. Is that correct, Denise? Cuba.
Yep.
So, and what's interesting, and Denise will be talking about this in more detail, but I just wanted to give you an overview that the civil unrest that's been developing this summer in Cuba has had racial overtones, and we can never separate colonization from race. And when we see the protests going on, it's been interesting to see the arc of Cuban American history. And President Biden has been taking a very tough line, and some people have actually said he's been tougher on Cuba than President Trump was. And Denise will be talking more about Obama and the Cuban Thaw as well. But we're going to be looking at kind of how we got here. And it is 1 month after those protests remained. There are, as we're having this presentation right now, there are Cubans that are in jail because they're trying to express themselves politically. And with that as a setup, I guess the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to you again, Denise, is why are we doing this on August 12th, Denise? Why not August 11th? Was your schedule free?
Right. No, it was not. And August 12th is actually when the conversation happened to really initiate the Treaty of Paris, right? It wasn't signed until September 3rd, but August 12th is really where all of this begins and how the United States and Cuba form a relationship that a lot of people haven't really discussed. And what we're looking at right now in the conversation amongst the protests is a lot of it isn't going past 1950, and everyone's just looking at the Castro Cuba. But we really need a lot more context in a global sense, but also to really understand the United States interactions throughout time and how they've kind of treated Cuba over the years. right? As well as I think the main question going on right now politically is, when will the United States get involved? And so having to kind of go through the entire timeline is really important so that you can kind of understand where the context lies. I'm also coming from the place where I am a veteran of the United States Navy. I was stationed in Guantanamo Bay for quite a long period of time. And so I do have a military aspect to this as well that I'm going to kind of dive into later. And I'm going to show you what's going on around the world, around Cuba, and how the military is reacting kind of through all of the turmoil that's happening in a considerable part of these islands, right? Did you want to say something, Dr. K, just before I keep going?
I wanted to first ask, and I want to bring it back home personally. You said you're second generation Cuban American. What was that like when you got your orders and you found out you were being assigned to Gitmo?
I was confused, to be honest with you, because I didn't really know a lot about Guantanamo Bay at the time. I kind of knew it was there, but I didn't really understand what its place was in the U.S. military industrial complex. Like, what is the purpose of having the base there, and what were we doing? But at the time when we were moving the detainees over from Abu Ghraib, we kind of got shoved into that space. And I learned a lot about Cuba and US's interactions together through being stationed there, through talking to people who were there, you know, for the first part of, you know, the diaspora through Castro, right? Who were ending up running over into Guantanamo Bay and seeking asylum and becoming exiles through Gitmo as well. So there's a lot of things that are going on that are probably not as privy to the average person who's kind of viewing this from the outside. And that's why I think it's so important to kind of grab everything and put it all together so you have a more well-rounded view, you know, of the truth of the history behind everything.
And we're setting this up, as you said, with the Treaty of Paris ending the Spanish-American War. But I just got to jump in and say it's not very well known that the United States tried to purchase Cuba at least twice from Spain. As in the antebellum period, some Southerners wanted to annex, and they offered $130 million to Spain for Cuba so that they could add another slave state to the United States. And later, there was an offer of $300 million on the table as well to purchase it. So the history is a long history between these two countries.
So I'm so sorry about that. Yes, I actually do agree with that. There was back in the day in the I believe it was the 1850s or 1860s, when the Confederates actually saw Cuba as how we say, not the transportation of the slaves, but take advantage, that's what I'm looking for, as for, you know, lower income of slavery. And I did read upon that not too long ago. And thank you for that, Doctor. I forgot your name. I'm so sorry. It's been a very busy day for me.
Well, we're glad that you're here. My name's Tom, and I'm very happy that you're here. Thank you. Denise, did you want to talk a little bit about this slide some more, or should we continue?
Yeah, so just to kind of hit a few points that we're kind of seeing on this slide from 1898 into the early part of the 1900s, right? You have the U.S. having a whole other situation going on the mainland. But as far as Cuba is concerned, right after the Treaty of Paris, it is 90% Black, right? So these are majority slaves who they are now, the United States is trying to grab the tobacco fields, grab the sugar fields and move them into the South, or also kind of adopt a possibility of taking all of the South's kind of slavery and pushing it into the islands, kind of giving it some distance from slavery as a whole. So this is really important to know as we go into the Cuban affairs and their relationship between the United States, because William Howard Taft ends up becoming the first provisional governor of Cuba, which is kind of crazy to think of a country that is now said to be independent, yet we're still seeing a provisional governor in place, where we don't really see something like that unless we look to Puerto Rico, which makes sense, right? Because the US takes them in as a colony, they become a territory. And for Cuba, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You also have a lot of...
Maybe our next presentation, because you're going to come back for more, the Philippines as well, the Puerto Rico, Cuban, and Filipino experience, very similar.
Very, very similar. They're all kind of having the same moment because the United States is grabbing everybody after the Spanish-American War and deciding what are we going to do, and each of them are kind of getting different versions of the experiment in a sense, right? Of this political experiment of what the U.S. is going to do in their involvement. Now, when you end up getting Jose Miguel Gomez becoming the president following a U.S. supervised election, which was completely corrupted, right? They knew it was corrupted. They still let him like kind of be in place. And he's like, hey, there's a revolt going on with the Black Cubans in the area. And we kind of need this to die out because they want to form their own political party. The US gets involved, comes over, occupies Cuba, helps them kill off all of these people in the Afro-Cuban revolt, right? Just to stop them from forming a political party. And in turn, Cuba now creates a law that says you can't form a political party based on race, right? So this kind of takes us into the early part of the 1900s, and we're still pre-Castro, right? So yeah, you can go off into the next.
I just gotta jump in, and you have on the slide the Platt Amendment, probably the biggest head scratcher in terms of U.S. legislation. I mean, it's up there with the biggies. The Platt Amendment said we're going to give Cuba independence, but we reserve the right to take it back if we change our mind. I mean, it's just crazy.
It also gives them control of Guantanamo Bay at the same time, right? So this is strategic. We're not just having a discussion of slavery and there being other root causes, but we're also looking at a military strategy standpoint here for the United States. And that's why it's so important not to leave that out when we discuss it in its entirety. Because the pre-Castro Cuba era kind of gets this idea of being romanticized, right? Like, oh, but they were wealthy and it was beautiful in Cuba. And what does that mean? Which actually isn't necessarily true. The United States and Cuba were trading into a point where the United States was taking over 90% of Cuba's trade. And then in turn gave them some loans and some money at a very ridiculous interest rate and asked them to pay those back, which it gave this idea of a lucrative, beautifully big and bountiful Cuba. But in reality, just like you were saying, Dr. Keith, it's similar to the Philippines. The people who are living in La Habana are now forced to work at the casinos. They're forced into prostitution. There's a lot of drugs going on. There's the mafia is hugely involved in a lot of part of the politics that are happening at that point of time as well. Well, and speaking of the politics of the nation and how people are living, if you're looking at the Havana as a small microcosm for what stands for Cuba, you'd be completely mistaken. Everything outside of that looks completely different. These people, even though it looks like it's lucrative, out in La Fincas or like in the farms, out in the other mainland areas, are not seeing the benefit of any of that money. That money is staying in La Habana. It is meant to circulate La Habana and to bring tourism in, right? So this has always been a problem. The leadership that's been in place in Cuba or been placed in Cuba through the United States occupation or through their connection, right, has considerably always been dictatorship. This dictatorship idea does not begin with Fidel Castro. He just takes it to a whole new level, right? Because in the 30s, when Batista kind of takes over and leads his coup, he completely changes the system in Cuba. So their constitution changes. He stops people from being able to run for public office. He now has become the dictator. But because he had a lot of American influence and he was bartering continuously with America and they were allowing each other to kind of behave in these mannerisms, he continues his state in being a dictator that is completely allowed then by that sense, by the American government. They're continuing to process this. And also parts of all of these elections leading up to it weren't even really worthy. Nobody was actually voting in the way that people thought that they were. And most of them were corrupted. So from the beginning of Cuba's connection and its freedom from, let's say, Spanish rule, there is immediately problems with the connection between Spanish rule and now American imperialism and American colonialism. One is going to be traded for the other.
Tell me more about Castro, because when we were preparing for this, you were saying how he used to believe in like a Western liberal democracy, and he became jaded. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Castro started off as a lawyer, and I don't know if a lot of people really know the story, but he was very liberal, and he kind of was upset, and he knew what was happening financially. He knew that Cuba and the relationship with the United States was leading to a place where they were going to become financially dependent. And then this was just going to mean that the US is going to kind of take over. But he wasn't the first one to have these conversations. Jose Marti was having those conversations when we're back in the Spanish American wartime, right? So he takes it to a different place, and he wanted to have those conversations openly. But Batista takes over and then completely says, no, you can't run for any official position. So he's like, okay, well, if I can't run for an official position, then what do I need to do? And he gets in bed with a considerable amount of interesting people, including Che Guevara, right? So this changes a lot of, I believe, Fidel's ideology, because now he's just, for lack of better terminology, he's pissed off, right? And now it's different. He has to kind of claim that space, which we see a huge shift in him from the beginning into what you end up seeing in the 50s with Fidel completely taking over that dictatorship.
So we get to 56. So we have the revolution, right?
Yes, which is like super intense too. You know, the conversations that are happening between Marxists at the time, which is what like Che would like to say about himself. But they're diluted, right? So a lot of it is Castro saying, I'm a socialist, or I'm a Marxist, or I'm trying to look at this in a more liberal way. And that's not the reality of the situation. He knew he was a communist to begin with and chose to portray a certain outside in order to piss the United States off, for lack of also better terminology, right? So the two of them are battling back and forth consistently, right? And that leads into other conversations with the embargo and how they are now imposing certain things on Cuba. You end up coming into the Soviet Union. Now Castro is like, hey, fine, if you don't want to sit down and have a conversation about this and kind of replot how you're trying to colonize my space, then we don't need to have a conversation. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So it starts that whole breeding, right? While underneath, the US knows that it's been involved in a considerable amount of things that have kind of led to this point, that have caused this level of anarchy and distrust for America as a whole through Castro's regime, right? So when they break off these diplomatic relations, and a lot of the conversation that's happening now is this argument of, it's not about the embargo, it's not about the embargo. And as a whole, no, it's not about the embargo. The dictator still needs to take accountability for the actions that they have taken against their people. But we all know, I think at this point, through some form of research into the history of kind of dictatorship, we know that egging the dictator on or pushing them in a certain way is going to lead to repercussions, which are going to lead to those people in their area being the ones who are dealing with it, right? So a lot of this play back and forth starts to begin, and you can feel the tension because Castro's just not willing to kind of give in the same way Batista was willing to.
And I think I would add to that, it's there is a selectivity in which dictators are bad, right? That Castro was designated as a bad dictator by the United States government during the Cold War because he joined the sphere of influence of the Soviets. But his actions are not dissimilar to dictators that are being backed by the United States and other parts of the Western Hemisphere and beyond.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of commonality between his placement in Cuba and the similarities between someone that's, say, like Saddam Hussein, right? Who, when we look at the Middle East as a whole, as the leader that we kind of had a lot of manipulation in, and when he decided he no longer wanted to play, there was a whole lot of other things that ended up coming behind that, right? And so there's a similar back and forth happening. What's interesting, I think, about Castro and about Cuba as a whole is that it's 90 miles away. So these kind of atrocities that we're going across all of the other side of the world for are happening 90 miles from our shore, yet we're not getting as involved as we should, nor do we want to. And we'll get to those strategic reasons as to why kind of the US is in this place right now. But the tightening and the loosening and the changing of the embargoes and the going and the backs and the forth has caused a considerable amount of tension over the years. The current dictatorship now, not led by a Castro, right, might definitely have different motivation, but we're just discussing the motivation of where this dictatorship is kind of picking off, like where they're picking up from, as the Castros are kind of leaving that kind of view in that space.
A lot of Americans have heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think a lot of Americans have also heard of the Mariel boat lift. And I guess I'm confused. That's like the 1980s. But you said you're second generation Cuban. Can you talk to us a little bit about the patterns of Cuban immigration to the United States?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times we synonymize the Cuban diaspora with the Mariel boat lift, and these exiles coming in. But this was happening far before that even happened. So you have a definite racial separation happening in Cuba, where the Black Cubans are considerably living much more destitute lives at this point than those that are more light skinned or that have a stronger Spanish tie to the colonization of the island itself. Now, those lighter skinned Cubans had a lot of money at the time. And with Batista being in power, we're able to cultivate that money and go, we got to get out of here because we see that this is kind of starting to go sideways and we need to protect our own and leave. So my grandparents flew over here on a plane. Okay, so
a boat, swimming.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't even. It might have been an actual little proppy plane. I don't know. It was 90 miles.
No, I was trying to be sarcastic because you're talking about waves of immigration based on wealth.
Yes.
And yet we stereotype Cuban immigration as being on boats.
Correct, and that's not necessarily true. The wealthy Cubans had already left in the late 40s and were starting to come into Miami and South Florida and really build that area up. Right. It wasn't until much later that you start to see the Mariel boat lift. Right. So it's like 30 years later, and I think a lot of people kind of lose that connection. But the first real part of the diaspora happens in the late 40s into the early 50s, before Castro even really takes any kind of hold yet.
Now, I'm looking at the slides that you've prepared for us, and I see 125,000 Cubans coming with the boat lift. I see an agreement in where 20,000 Cubans can come a year. I thought in this time period, the United States was beginning to be anti-Latinx immigration. It seems to be a little bit of a disconnect from the policies towards other Latinx countries. No?
It absolutely does look like a disconnect. And I think that's strategic on America's behalf, right? So it's strategic in multiple ways. And we were discussing that earlier as well, right? So the United States letting Cubans in is like, okay, we know what we've done in a sense, and we're going to kind of give you this space because we kind of have to. You're so close by that we just don't want to rock the boat, right? But it benefits them in other ways because now it can showcase Cuba and Cuba's leaders as faulty, as cruel, as demonstrative, right? So they could go, oh, look what they're doing to their people. They're right there. It's only 90 miles, right? It's different when I think a lot of people try to picture certain parts of Latin America that are so much further down the way. So it's a little bit harder to kind of give that context to connect it. But every time somebody talks about Cuba, it's like, oh, it's only 90 miles away. And you're like, exactly, it's that close. So it posed a strategic position for them. But also the Mariel boat lift was not this beautiful kind of idealized situation either, right? These people were taken from the boats and put into tent cities under I-95, right? With barely any resources or water. They were caged in. They built cages for them basically under the highway. And that was how they had to figure it out and how to start their lives were from there if they were allowed to be released, because they were also given that same connotation. Oh, these are rapists, these are killers, these are criminals. And the majority of them were political prisoners who were just trying to survive and being arrested for pretty much a slew of different crimes that are, to us, would seem completely ridiculous. You know what I mean? So just speaking of independence would land you in prison. And those are the people that were also sent over. So it wasn't entirely as beautiful as so many, I think, have kind of defined it over the years.
And then with that pushback, the U.S. government created another new policy, wet foot, dry foot. Can you explain that?
It sounds just like it is, Dr. K. If your foot was wet and now it's dry on the land, guess what? You're good to go.
So
right?
if the U.S. Coast Guard apprehends Cubans trying to come to the United States, if their feet are wet, they get sent back to Cuba. If they get to the beach and their foot is dry, they're allowed to stay here under political asylum.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes on. So then Obama changes now, like the embargo, and then we're trying to have other relationships later, and we're trying to figure out all of this stuff. And it's like, oh, it looks like it's getting better, right? Cuba's like, okay, we're going to take American money. We're going to try to kind of redo this whole thing. And that completely changes as soon as, Trump takes over. But in the span of this time, too, we have things like Elian Gonzalez, which I think a lot of people have forgotten about over the years as well. His mother died trying to bring him to the United States while she was escaping Cuba, and his father was still in Cuba. So the fight that happened in Miami between his family and the Cuban government about who was going to have this child really started an uproar. And it was pretty much like a huge conversation. And we hadn't really talked about Cuba for a while, up until that point. And this started a huge back and forth. And I don't know if you remember the photos of that, but they took him from his family's home at gunpoint, right? Like they had M16s to this poor little 9-year-old face while he was hiding in the closet. So there's a lot of really complex interactions that are there. And once Elian gets back to Cuba, it becomes even more complicated because now he is involved with the communist regime. He is seen as a face to Fidel and as a confidant in that space. So you see him a lot through propaganda after the years after that to go see, he's fine. We took care of him. But of course they did, because the communists are holding all of the money and resources.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify,
right?
That happened in the Clinton administration.
Correct.
And then we get up to the Obama administration. It's now been 20 years of the Cold War ending. The Soviet sponsorship of the Cuban regime has collapsed. The Soviets used to provide a lot of financial support and oil, energy, basically at a discount to prop up the Cuban regime. And so President Obama, kind of modeling after what Bill Clinton did with Vietnam, tries to start this process of normalization of relations. He actually visited Cuba. And I think I have the picture on the next slide, if that's okay to go to. Here's a picture most people during the Cold War never thought they would see. This is the president of the United States shaking hands with a Castro. This is Raul Castro. His brother passed away and he assumes the presidency. And there's a handshake between the president of the United States and the president dictator of Cuba. What's going through your mind, Denise, when you see this?
I was shocked, but I always knew that Raul had a little bit of a different idea of what he wanted to do. And he had made that known over the years, right? So we knew we were going to see some change with the shift between the Castros. I think there was just a lot of desensitization to any kind of shift, because we had Fidel in power for so long, right?
So let me ask you
it almost
this.
Seems like he was the god of Cuba for forever,
Had Fidel still been alive, would that handshake have happened?
No. And there's also a documentary. There's a few things in the slides for later too to go and check out. But there's a lot of documentaries also that are showcasing Fidel and going in a different light. There's one that he just the photographer just, I think, a couple of years ago released it. He spent a lot of time with Fidel back and forth over the years, and he was on a plane with him coming into the United States. And they all knew, they did all the paperwork, they had everything going on. And here in comes the FBI and the CIA, and they kind of charge the plane, and they're like, let me see your passport. And they're pulling everybody's passports out. And the guy's holding the camera, and they just kind of looked at him and they were like, okay, whatever. And Fidel just turns to him and goes, see what I mean? See, are they asking you for your passport? Do they think the whole flight is a terrorist flight? but how come you're special? And I'm the president of a country, right? And so he took a lot of those things as slight, as just an inhumane way to behave. I think parts of him did want diplomacy, and other parts of him really needed that control to fill his own ego. Which
well, you mentioned in your notes, you mentioned Operation Mongoose and a couple of assassination attempts, but there's a British documentary called something like 534 Ways to Kill Castro. To your point, I think I might take that personally as well. But how do the presidents are shaking hands, and now we're at 2021 and there's rioting in the streets. How do we go from a shaking of hands to today?
Sorry, we flip administrations, right? So now we go into the Trump administration. He reinstates Cuba on the list of the State Department's list of sponsored terrorism, which Obama had removed them from, right? And he's now changing all of these kind of different dynamics on how the relationship was moving forward, right? So now the relationship is moving backward, and Raul is not really taking charge anymore. Cuba has a new president, right? So now how is he going to handle being kind of treated in this space, which is important to recognize as well, to know Cuba's not just being looked at by Cubans, it's being looked at by leaders in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, China, Iran. Like, it's a global issue. So their response to everything is going to be extremely important for their allies to see how they're going to hold tough into their own beliefs. And you're kind of seeing that happening right now, right? So the embargo is shifted, the embargo is completely changed, and you have the dictatorship having a massive reaction, going, well, fine, if you're going to change everything, then I'm just not going to feed these people then, right? Which is kind of ridiculous because the US does send over goods. They do send food, they send health supplies, all the time. So whether or not the people have access to that is outside of their control. So this is where the argument that's happening right now is coming into play amongst Cubans of the diaspora or Cuban Americans. It's the dictatorship's fault, right? And I'm like, yes, the dictatorship totally needs to take responsibility for their own actions and what they've done to their people. But it's not only the dictatorship's fault, and they're looking for the United States to get involved. And how are we going to look for the United States to get involved? We have to look back at our previous relationship with the United States and make sure that we also don't continue to make the same mistake, which can obviously put us back in the same position, as it's been repetitive with US intervention in Cuba over the years.
Well, you mentioned the rest of the world is watching, and at the very beginning of the presentation, you talked about your military service as well as the military industrial complex. And I know you had made some suggestions about some of that military industrial complex is in play here, right?
Absolutely. So since Cuban protests have begun, we've seen some interesting moves from not only our military, but from militaries across the world, right? So the United States just built a new aircraft carrier, and they decided to launch 40,000 tons worth of explosives 100 miles off of the coast of Florida in the Gulf. On their brand new carrier, as you can see the photo right there. What's interesting about this is that brand new carriers in the United States Navy do not go to Key West. They usually go to Norfolk or they go to San Diego. It's because they would rather test these kind of things in the Chesapeake Bay, where they have jurisdiction, and they also know that they aren't doing a massive amount of damage. The bay has been kind of put into those places to be able to have this kind of functionality. You don't have that functionality at Key West. I also think the distance is important to note here. This is 100 miles off of the coast of Florida. So from the Key West base to the outlying streets of Havana, you're talking exactly 100 miles, 106 to the main capital. So the United States military doesn't kind of do these things for no reason. And I like to call this military peacocking, or, military just kind of showing off. Hey, look what we can do, right? Air, land, and sea. We saw a lot of the same kind of things in the desert happening, like in Vegas, and not too far below us in like Arizona and things like that when we got into Iraq and Afghanistan, right? People were like, wow, they're setting off explosives in the desert. It's peacocking. They're trying to show the world what's going on. But while we're doing that, Russia is doing the same thing in the Arctic, and they are building a I can't even say it without kind of giggling a little bit, not because it's funny, but because it boggles my mind They're building a torpedo with a nuclear reactor base, right? And this torpedo is specifically designed to hit into the coastline and then spread its nuclear reaction everywhere, completely decimating all sorts of sea life. And it could also collapse different parts of certain islands. So it's kind of like they took their Chernobyl disaster and then like turned it into a weapon.
Weaponizing it. Yeah.
They're
Now,
weaponizing it. Yeah.
Do you believe in coincidences?
Absolutely not.
Because I got a couple of coincidences for you. Coincidence number one, after President Trump wins election in 2016 and reverses the Cuban thaw, all of a sudden, Brits and Americans in Havana started getting sick, and they call it Havana syndrome. And then that went away. And then after these detonations that you're talking about off the coast of Cuba, coincidence number two, Havana syndrome comes back.
It's spiking in Vienna around all of these really secret hush-hush three-letter agencies. And I think it's fascinating, right? We haven't seen this many cases since in Havana itself, right? So all of them are happening within days of each other, right? But also, let's remember that on Guantanamo Bay, we've got some detainees left, and a lot of them have gone to Russia, right? And so the argument is that Russia is going to torture them. From the secret operative side, it would be that they're just going to flip them and try to get as much information as possible. But also, they're still detained in that area. And as the US is trying to figure out what to do with them, you're seeing a lot of this posturing, right? And you go, oh, okay. So for me in my head, I take right back to World War II. And I'm like, wow, Cuba kind of is now reminding me of Hawaii, right? And is this going to be really what is going to initiate United States involvement? So if you have any small base of military history, you would know the US doesn't really get involved, right? Unless they're egged on or pushed. And then it kind of shows that, oh, I'm out to defend myself. So from their military positioning standpoint, waiting for something massive to happen in Cuba or for that base to be attacked or messed with in any way is really what's going to initiate that push. It's why they're keeping such a level of.
We have about 5 more minutes, and then we're going to come to go to discussion and questions. So let's take us home, Denise.
Yeah, let's just also not forget about American colonialism and imperialism, which is totally true. And you can see the flip side of the coin if you're really interested by looking at Puerto Rico and the research that I was kind of presenting before, right? So we have to remember that the US still was a colonizer, right? Living in this bubble or in this idea that the United States has had these perfect relations with all these countries and that they're bringing this bearing of freedom is not necessarily true, right? And so that context goes into something further that I usually discuss heavily, especially since the Puerto Rico presentation, right? The idea of colonial Stockholm syndrome. This idea of feeling like the colonizer has your best interest in mind. And this doesn't necessarily mean that it's only from the point of view of the colonized. It can also be of the point of view of those who have been subjugated basically to this considerable amount of propaganda, right? You're believing the hype. Don't believe the hype, right? There's a lot more going on down there. And a lot of the political cartoons from that time really show you exactly that, right? So like the one that we're looking at right now that has Puerto Rico on there, Cuba's on there, Hawaii, I believe the Philippines also is on here. And the main quote that's on the blackboard that I just kind of want to punch at is this one: is the consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without their consent until they can govern themselves. But when will they ever be able to govern themselves? We don't know. It's not up to them. It's not their choice, right? So when we go into the next slide, now I'm going to breeze through. So we can look to Puerto Rico, the flip side of the coin that everybody likes to talk about. Why can't Cuba just be like PR? PR is dealing with a whole lot of stuff also since 1898. Their flag was banned. Any conversations about independence in any way was met with death or treason, or las carpetas, where you were followed for 50 years and completely investigated by every three-letter organization you can imagine. And now, right now, the US has a fiscal oversight board that's on top of Puerto Rico, which means anything the Puerto Rican government says the US can overturn and go, hey, it's going to make us profit. Sucks that it might destroy some natural resources for you, and that your government said no, but we said yes. So in that essence, right, and that's how I'm kind of been looking at it back and forth, what really is the difference in certain aspects, right? The United States has continued to treat Puerto Rico this way. They've done experiments on Puerto Rican women for birth control, right, for a considerable amount of time. Okay, they've tortured considerable amount of Puerto Ricans. They forcibly conscripted them into the military, right? So there's a lot of cleanup and a lot of things that make PR kind of look like it's the perfect place to be. But in reality, there's a whole lot of other underlying concerns that show us the United States has done the same thing over and over. So the behavior is just expected. They've done it with everyone they basically got in the Treaty of Paris. So it's like a whole grouping of all of these islands. And that's why you keep talking about the Philippines, because we see a lot of the same things happening there as well.
And you have a goodie bag for them that we'll drop in the chat after we stop sharing the slide. But thank you so much, Denise, Vamp, Zubizarreta. It has been, once again, a pleasure to work with you. And I always learn from you. This is good stuff. And here are some of the resources that you have. I'll drop those in the chat in a moment. And these are the reference slides, because we're all good researchers here. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen, and I will, Denise, how many times have I told you you're awesome today? Denise,
a lot.
Zubizarreta, thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much for having us.
And thank you for joining. Thank you.